Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have lots of questions today. Can the same technology that we happily bring into our homes and we keep in our pockets, that's making life and connections and knowledge easier to access, can this all be turned around and weaponized against us? Let's get to the bottom line. Usually when someone talks about killer tech, people imagine giant killer robots vaporizing people and destroying cities with huge laser beams, Hollywood style. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today we're keeping it real. We all love to use facial recognition to open our phones, but at the same time we know that facial recognition can be used by security agencies to pick us out of a crowd. So what does the future hold for us as we freely give away our privacy in exchange for convenience? Fortunately, we have three people in the room who have all the answers to these questions. Larry Irving, a lawyer by training who has spent his life working on the infrastructure of the internet. In September, Larry became the first African-American ever to be inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame. Congratulations, my friend. Ina Fried, who has been covering the internet since before most of us even used it. She is the chief technology correspondent for the news website Axios. And then Professor Holden Thorpe, the editor-in-chief of Science Magazine and all the journals published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So good to have you all here today. But Ina, let me start with you and ask about what we've heard this week about China requiring anyone that buys a future mobile phone of registering their, through a facial recognition system that will permanently record the population of China on this. Is this something that scares you? Is it something that we ought to have some trepidation about?
I think there's two big issues there. One is it's sort of the last erosion of the idea that the internet is anonymous. When Larry and I started looking at the internet, you really could be anonymous. And that's really gone away as a notion anyway. But I think what facial recognition opens up is, targeted surveillance. So not the idea that what you say will be used against you, because I think, for a lot of people in the public eye, you sort of are used to that. But the idea that the government can easily track you. So one of the things you saw in Hong Kong was people wearing masks so they wouldn't be identified for going to the protest, and then the government passed a law against masks. So I do think there's this erosion of privacy that is really important. And this, when you combine facial recognition, it's one thing to use it in a public place, but it's being used increasingly in private spaces or as a condition of entry into spaces. And I think that's where
we now have information that is leaked out of China that in places like Xinjiang, where there's a large Uyghur population, that these technologies are brought together to sort of categorize, record, and to penalize, imprison, detain part of the population there. But as I was reading about Xinjiang in China and what was going on with facial recognition software, I was literally reading it as I was going through the line at the airport in the line called Clear, which is a facial recognition-based system that I have paid someone to allow me to skip the line. How far are we potentially away from having steps where we look a lot like China?
And not very far at all, I think. And I think it's going to come, if we don't do something, it's going to come on us much faster than we think. And here's the reason. There's a lot of devices out with the capability of doing it and very few rules over how the technology is used. You have all the major tech companies, or at least many of them, coming out and saying, we actually want Congress to pass some rules here of how governments use this technology, because they want to sell it. They want to sell it. They don't want to be the ones making the rules, but they do believe there should be rules. Now, they'd have a lot to say if those rules were too restrictive, but I think we are very close to that. And you've seen a lot of controversies this year that are worth paying attention to. The one I look at the most is over Amazon's Ring. These are, home doorbells. The ostensible premise was...
What's it called, Ring?
Ring. Amazon bought a startup called Ring, and Ring was doing these internet-connected smart doorbells. So you could push a button, you could let the UPS guy drop off a package because you could see it, you could buzz them in. That technology, now when there's a crime in an area, the police are saying, hey, everyone with a Ring cam, turn over your footage. Well, maybe that's good in catching a criminal, but it can also be used for more blanket surveillance.
Larry, you helped give birth to the internet in the United States. How much should we blame you for the problems we have today?
You have to blame a lot of us. It's funny, I was at the 50th anniversary of the internet. UCLA had 50th, and Leonard Kleinrock, who is the guy who sent the first message. It was supposed to be login, it became LO, but it went from UCLA to Menlo Park. And he was saying right then that, kind of like the Manhattan Project, you're really excited about, you did something for your country, did something great technologically, But there were some unintended consequences that all of us, looking at it now, why didn't we see this? Why didn't we understand it? And to Ina's point about, and your point about how close are we, interestingly, on my way down to Costa Rica for the Internet Society's Internet Hall of Fame event, I had to go through a camera that was taking my photo to get out of the country. Now, the DHS has discontinued that. I think it's in the last few week or so. But there was, the United States government had a program that, and here was a scary thing. You go to this camera, it tells you, hi, Larry Irving, you're sitting in 18F. No one expects it when they show up to the airport that there's some camera that knows who you are by your face. I didn't show a ticket. Through my face, they knew who I was and knew that I was sitting in seat 18F. Not vastly different from what we're seeing in China, and equally scary.
So, and it gets into that whole
it's
convenience.
going to be the future. We're going to see a lot more of that.
And you kind of want the convenience.
Right.
You don't have to show, it cuts down on if you lose your paper ticket, if your phone battery dies, you still get your seat.
So Larry, some of your work really represents the tension here that I want to get to today, which is, in part, you coined the term and helped popularize the concern about the digital divide, people being left out, not having access to the internet. We talk about this globally today, about those that are not yet wired in, not connected. But if you go into the United States, there are communities with children that do not have regular internet access. On the other hand, we have the turbocharged side, where those of us who have lots of gadgets and sensors and 5G coming and the Internet of Things, where millions of gadgets will be connected and basically taking stock of everything that we do, that's also dangerous. So you sort of, for me, represent both sides of the scale here.
So New York,
how do you get it right?
We haven't got it right. We're not close to getting it right, and we're not asking the right questions. I was in New York last week, City University of New York. There are little kids at City University of New York who are doing their term papers on their cell phones. In the greatest city in the world, 250,000 students, some percent of them are doing their term papers, according to the professors, on their cell phones. There are more people in New York City without broadband access than there are people in Houston. Wow. 1 out of 3 people in New York City don't have broadband access for affordability reasons. There are more of them than there are people in Houston. On the other side, every one of those kids is caught up in the internet revolution in a good way and a bad way. Their faces are in some database. The commercial sales, they're still buying stuff on Amazon. There are still things that affect them, but we're not making policies that equitably distribute this. And here's the really scary thing. What worries me, and I don't know if Holden or Ina have the same concern, those of us who have some amount of wealth can buy our way out of some of the privacy problems. Folks who don't have much income, they're going to have to give their privacy to get access to some of the benefits of the internet. And that's something we should be very fearful of. And as you look at developing countries, that's even more of a problem, because if you don't have money, what are you giving those guys for free access? You're giving them You're giving them access to send you more information, to buy stuff, or to tell them things about you.
Holden, I think that's something that we've seen with every technological advance, is that we haven't figured out, after centuries really, how to equitably distribute it.
But I definitely agree with Larry that part of it is we're not asking the right questions. And, Silicon Valley, and I've covered it for 20 years, is great at producing that next big thing, at doing it just as soon as it can possibly done. As an industry, and we've seen a lot of discussion over the last year as this has dawned on society, the internet industry, the tech industry is not good at all when it comes to asking, should we? How should we do this? What are the unintended consequences? And it's funny, because you talk to somebody in tech, and they'll always say, all tech can be used for good or bad, which I would agree with, but it's usually meant to mean, therefore, oh, well, we're just going to make it, not all technology can be used for bad. How are we going to deal with the unintended consequences?
Holden, to that, what most freaks you out about what's coming?
Well, I think things don't freak me out as much as you might think, and the reason is because
You're the Dr. Strangelove character.
Well, in my world, the scientists are all very devoted to seeing how to do all of these things ethically. I mean, for example, we ran an editorial a few weeks ago from the person who invented CRISPR, where she's talking about how important it is to have the right kinds of regulations and things when it comes to gene editing. So in terms of what flows through the AAAS or the Science magazine and what we see almost everybody concerned about all sides of this.
But who violated the norms of the gene editing work that she did?
Yes, a scientist in China who altered the genes of 2 embryos. And I think the learning from that, which has only come out in the last few days, is that he did not do something that we require when people publish studies on humans, which is that they post the protocol on a server that has all human studies on it. So because his human studies protocol wasn't posted, that's how this thing went under the radar for as long as it did.
So how do we get this right in terms of, or how are groups getting it right? Are there any ones that impress you?
Well, there are some groups, like, for example, in artificial intelligence, a bunch of the companies that are serious about making a business out of it also are part of this Partnership for AI, a nonprofit group looking at the pitfalls. So there is some work, and AI, I would say, is the one. AI and facial recognition are kind of the areas where I think, sort of the tech world knew going in that there were going to be ethical issues that needed to be confronted.
Did they know that AI patterns would come in and sometimes create racist outcomes because of the racist inputs and biases?
Algorithmic bias is a huge problem, and it was a post hoc problem. I mean, you had a group of Caucasian, mostly men, who made some assumptions, and then all of a sudden you're discovering that Congressional Black Caucus members are showing up as criminals because they didn't figure out that, oh, wait a minute, we haven't put enough in our sample size, doesn't include enough black people, brown people, or Asian people. So there is some post hoc. But the good news is, once they had a problem, they did begin to address it. And I'd add one other group is MIT's AI lab. I mean, I'm a Stanford guy and I'm on the board of Northwestern, so I don't always give MIT a lot of credit. But MIT has probably done the best job of convening people around AI over the last 5 or 6 years, the future of work, but also the ethical considerations around artificial intelligence. And you need those kinds of honest brokers, because my concern about industry groups is that they've got a profit motive. That they have a very clear, how do we get this to the market as fast as we can? And scientists are doing it for the love of science, but there's got to be somebody who's an honest broker.
Right.
And industry generally, if we've learned anything about the internet over the last 25 years, it's leaving self-governance just to the internet industry probably is going to be a suboptimal, lead to suboptimal solutions.
Ina?
So yeah, I mean, I think it's been pretty patchwork. I think in most areas there is very limited regulation. The one you bring up with autos, I mean, we saw this. The most basic information turns out to be really powerful. So if you look at where has technology aided crime fighting, a lot of the times it's the toll tracker that's on your dashboard, and all that does is pay the toll when you go through the bridge. But it turns out that's a lot of information for places where somebody goes through a bridge. Now imagine something that knows everywhere you've ever been. I think, though, when you think about it, and a lot of times we're looking at regulating the technology, as important is whether you have a free and open society, because we have to assume that information is going to come in. What we really need is a fair judicial system, a non-racist government, and most of us live in a society that is either very unequal or highly unequal, so we don't have that. So that makes the technology dangerous. I think we should be as worried about making sure we have the right civil society and civil liberties protections as we are regulating the technology.
Yeah, we just published a paper on algorithms that are used when people come into the hospital to decide who gets care. And there's nothing explicitly about race in these algorithms, but our paper showed that they were clearly distributing health care inequitably by excluding African Americans when they come to the hospital, and this algorithm is being used across almost all of American healthcare.
And we've seen this near universally. Whenever these algorithms have come in, and again, it's who's in the room. The group sitting in the room, maybe 5 well-intentioned white men, maybe 6, getting together to try and create something. And typically, what they're doing is taking all the human knowledge, all the decisions that have been made, and computerizing that. It turns out all you've done is codifying bias, because racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia have been part of the decision-making process. So you can't put in bad data and get an equitable outcome.
Should we be worried about deepfakes?
I mean, I think we should, and I think there's 2 issues. One is the technology that enables it, but the other is, do we have the critical thinking? Are kids being raised with this sort of media literacy of knowing to trust and who to trust? I think it's going to be only that much more necessary when you can make a video that looks like anyone saying anything. It already scares me in the world we live in that facts are so debatable right now, that there isn't an agreed upon set of truth, and then different opinions about what an ideal society should look like based on that. I feel like in the last 10 years, we've lost that sense of shared truth, which is going to be all the more important in an era where, again, you're going to be able to make a video. I can make a video of Larry saying, you know, sacrilege that Stanford isn't going to do well this year, when I know that that's not true. But how am I going to prove it when Larry, who went there, is you know, speaking out against it? And that's a humorous example, but I do think it's a serious issue.
Do you, when you think about Ina Fried one day sitting on tape saying that you really love what industry has done with AI and you have no concerns, what are the steps we need to put in place? Do America, any other government, need to put in place so that that is not permitted to happen?
I mean, there's a variety of things. I think it is a combination of, there are technologies being developed. You know, sometimes the solution to bad technology is more technology. Sometimes it's not. You know, I think there are these verified path things that would allow you to say that this video came from this source and hasn't been altered along the way. That's one piece of it. I think media literacy and understanding critical thinking are really the keys to surviving in a world that has this ability. But you know, it's going to be tough. It's going to be a tough problem when you can't trust the photos you look at, which is already somewhat true today, to you can't trust the audio, to you can't trust the video. I mean, those are big problems.
But we don't trust each other now, and we haven't even started. I mean, the whole question of whether or not we're going to teach ethics to computer scientists or ethics to lawyers in technology, we're not even really having that debate at the level we should have the debate, but there's a bigger problem. And that's that we're so used to, in the United States and Western Europe, leading the world in technological innovation and in creating the norms. Well, now we have another nation that's got 1.2 billion people. The norms are very different there. And when you're talking AI, because they have a larger base, they're going to have more information, more knowledge. One of the advantages that China has is they've got people who are as good as people in the West in terms of innovation now and developing these technologies.
And science, patents.
And science. And they've got 1.2 billion people to experiment on. And whether or not you're willing to be experimented doesn't matter.
Yeah, consent doesn't matter.
Consent does not matter. So they're going to have a lot more, you know, they're going to be able to run this over and over and over again, and their norms are not going to be our norms, and other autocratic nations are following their lead.
Well, this raises the key question that I asked the CEO of Microsoft. If the CEO of Microsoft is putting together norms and habits and trying to basically correct these for the U.S. and perhaps the Western marketplace, are there firms that are not part of this normative structure that are able to get a scale and to compete, where you essentially have gravity operating very differently, whether it's the internet or how we do health research, how we look at CRISPR babies? And I'm just wondering, given essentially the way America, which is still an incredibly strong economy, is nonetheless relatively smaller as a share of the global economy, whether or not our inability to wrestle China in and to these others to live with these sort of standards is a real problem. I'm going to go to you with this because you live in a world where science and the norms of them, you have lots of people who could choose to be very dangerous or who could choose to, and these can become economic points of strategic competition.
Yeah, we're seeing that a lot, and you know, because particularly Science Magazine itself is such a high-profile place to publish, you know, it's very valued anywhere to publish, but much more so in China than anywhere else. And so, because they're very caught up in their metrics and all of that, and we look very good in those metrics.
So they're trying to publish in
so
science?
We get a lot of great science from China, but you know, as Larry's saying, and as you're saying, the norms are quite different there, and so what stands up to peer review in the United States and what constitutes excellent scientific conduct can be very different with papers that come in, and we're balancing that where at the same time we want all scientists to collaborate because science is better when it's shared the most widely. And so saying, you know, xenophobic things about Chinese scientists is something that we are against personally, and also isn't good for science. But on the other hand, the norms that you're talking about are very different. And so this is a major challenge for lots of parts of life. But because science is so important in China, and because there are such crystal clear goals articulated by the government in terms of what they're supposed to achieve. That creates a lot of pressure to evaluate the science there as objectively as we possibly can.
Very quickly, Europe has tried to step forward and take a bolder stand on some of this, break up monopolies or restrict them, to create a right to be forgotten off the internet. The GDPR, the guidelines on privacy, are much stronger than I think exist in the United States. Is the direction that Europe is going something we should emulate, or is Europe still not getting around these issues to the degree you would like to see, given the challenges?
Well, they're not getting around the issues, but they certainly are starting from a different place, which has led them to different outcomes. So, I mean, this notion, this fundamental European notion, particularly strong in Germany, that your data belongs to you, has led to different outcomes than sort of this sense in the US that we're freely trading that data for services we like, or in China, that data was never yours in the first place. And that's a gross oversimplification, but you really do have distinctly different outlooks. You know, I think some of the individual points are debatable. The right to be forgotten, as a journalist, I'm not, a huge fan of. At the same time, I think, starting from a notion that we do have individual personal liberties is probably going to lead to a stronger societal outcome than either the approach that says you don't have the right, or anything you sign, or you never had the right in the first place.
Until this show, I thought there were days that I could escape the digital tracks I was leaving. I have a 2001 truck with none of the following devices, and I sometimes go use cash. I don't wear wearables, and leave my cell phone at home. And in that, I feel like I'm escaping. Now I'm hearing about Ring, and realize that I can still be tracked. But I just ask you, just as we close the last couple of minutes, just kind of give me, your top of mind thoughts on what you most worry about, or how we can escape a dystopian future and kind of have more positive as a result of our economic evolution and technological evolution, rather than the dystopian future. Just give me just top of mind things that you would say we need to implement.
Yeah, I think, as already been said a little bit, that the people who are developing, either discovering the science or developing the technology, need to take a more active role in promoting the just and equitable use of it. It's not good enough to say, oh, we made this and somebody else is using it for evil, but here's all the good things we did with it. We need to take some responsibility to try to influence that.
So what Einstein did.
And yeah, we don't get to be the person who gets kidnapped in the James Bond movie.
Ina?
I think the single biggest thing that we could do is really ensure that the people who are going to be affected by the technology are brought into the room, and that there's the right balance of people making the decisions. I think there are a lot of blind spots. Technology has a huge diversity gap, and that manifests itself.
So these are the people in the hospital. These are the consumers. These are the folks that are on the
but also
end
the scientists and the technologists.
Yeah,
right.
Science has this problem, and it's unacceptable.
Right. Larry?
I think that the first 20 years of the internet were probably these golden ages because there was some American leadership and we had clearly defined principles. We don't have clearly defined principles, and in the absence of U.S. leadership, somebody else is going to take that leadership role. Right now, that's China, and I'm not sure that's a world we want to live in.
What a great discussion. I'd like to thank you all for being with us. Axio Chief Technology Correspondent Ina Fried, Professor Holden Thorpe, Chief Editor of Science Magazine, and Internet of Hall of Famer Larry Ervig. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
So what is the bottom line? Albert Einstein once said, our much praised technological progress and civilization generally could be compared to an axe in the hand of a pathological criminal. It doesn't matter if it's 1932 or 2020, the same things that bring us joy can be weaponized. Nuclear technology can bring us energy and can destroy the world. You can have fun flying a drone with your kids, and other drones can remotely kill people. Digitizing our information makes our lives easier, but potentially puts our private lives all out in the open. Some things never change. Have a great year, and that's the bottom line.